All right, we are in our final session, and just getting my paperwork in order. And the subject for this evening is sexuality and other questions that you may have. And if you don't have any other questions, then we will have a relatively short session. Just want to get this on. Okay. Okay. So I want to repeat that if you want to get a official looking certificate, actually this is Travis's, I've prepared, looks like this, either electronically, spent a lot of time figuring out how to get my electronic signature on there. I can send it to you electronically. I can print it out on a nice sheet of paper and send it to you personally. But you should go to the final exam. And to get the final exam, you go to classes, Jewish literacy, and then right up on top, you can click and you'll see it's a fairly simple exam. I don't mean for you to spend a huge amount of time on it, but at least it shows that you were somewhat engaged, and actually even more appropriate, you know how to research things on the internet. Okay, so Judaism and sex. Sex and sexuality are not looked down upon in Judaism. As you will often hear in discussions of this nature, be fruitful and multiply is the first commandment, pru uvru, in the Torah. And reproduction is a primary but not the only goal of sex. So there are discussions, and you'll see as we go through it, some of these I may have mentioned in particular slides, that even couples that cannot have children because they are, one party is infertile, they're over the childbearing age, they may be of the same gender, but marriage and kiddushin is certainly recognized and encouraged among couples that are not able to bear children. So it is certainly true that sexuality for just the sake of reproduction is not considered to be the only goal of sex. One innovation, I think it's an innovation, I'm not so sure, 100% sure of the pre-Judaic history on this, is the idea of channeling sexuality through marriage. Marriage is definitely the ideal, and the prophets in particular talk about the relationship between God and Israel in metaphorical marriage terms. So Israel's faithlessness when Israel wanders off and worships other gods is compared to adultery, and I think language like harlot and whore are used to describe Israel when they go after other gods. And the key issue here is one of covenant. I mean, you hear this all the time. One of the questions on the final exam is, what is berit, which can also be spelled Brit, and in Ashkenazi Hebrew bris. And the word brit means covenant. We loosely use the word bris, to mean a circumcision, but it's because it's shorthand for the complete name for the circumcision ceremony, which is Brit Milah, the covenant of circumcision. But I would say a huge innovation in Judaism is the idea that God and Israel are connected with one another through a covenant, and there are obligations on both sides. And if you compare this with other, particularly the pagan religions, you will find the stories, charming and entertaining stories of the gods robbing and stealing and raping, and basically the gods can do whatever the gods want to do. Although there is certainly tension in Judaism about this, fundamentally the understanding is God has obligations to Israel, just as Israel has obligations to God. And the most famous example of that is when Abraham argues with God about the fate of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. And God says, I'm going to wipe them all out. And Abraham says, shall not the God of justice act justly? Namely, are you going to wipe out the innocent along with the guilty? So, and in rabbinic stories, in Midrash, one image for Sinai is God marrying the Jewish people, with the sky as the chuppah, and the Hebrew word for sky is rakia, which is like a canopy, because, you know, primitive mind, you look up and the sky looks like a bowl, and the Torah as the ketubah. In ancient times, you know, even in Judaism, marriage certainly is not an equal partnership. As we discussed when we discussed the wedding ceremony, and maybe there's more discussion of that here, I can't quite remember. The husband is acquiring the wife. The innovation in Judaism, which is a step in the right direction, is lots of guarantees about the husband's obligation to his wife. And it contains things about how he will treat her and clothe her and care for her and even sexually be available to her. And then there's also built into the marriage contract, a traditional ketubah, a divorce settlement, so that if they should split up, there's actually a sum of money that he will pay to her. And the ketubah actually has a security lien in his assets that she can then, you know, go to a court and claim should they divorce. And in fact, a very common phrase in Hebrew for getting a divorce is to grant her ketubah, or to pay her ketubah. It's the marriage settlement. Divorce is mentioned in the Bible, and it talks about the husband granting his wife a divorce. Although actually 7 times in the Bible, the Bible talks about when a man acquires a wife. None of the details, none of the ceremonies, you know, the circling, the blessings, the breaking of the glass, the chuppah, none of that is in the Bible. Everything that we have in a Jewish ceremony relating to marriage is all Talmudic. And there's there's an entire tractate of Talmud called Kiddushin, which is one of the words for marriage. There's all kinds of issues relating to sexuality, and I think we're going to talk about all of them. Homosexuality, polygamy, adultery, mamzerut. We'll talk about, I think we get into about specifically what a mamzer is. Mamzer is often described as the Hebrew word for bastard, but a mamzer has a very technical definition in Jewish law. A couple having a child out of wedlock doesn't make the child a bastard or illegitimate. A child is a mamzer only if that child is born out of a forbidden relationship. And typically incest would be the classic one, but also certain other forbidden, incest and adultery would be the 2 most common examples. And we'll talk a little bit about premarital sex. So again, going back to the original thought, sex is natural and desirable. The first thing that God describes in the Bible as not being good is loneliness. In the opening chapter of Genesis, there's 7 days of creation. The 7th day is a rest, 6 days of active creation. At the end of all of every day, God says either things were good, a few days were very good, and nothing is perfect and nothing is bad. And then we're in chapter 2 of Genesis in the Garden of Eden, and we have this expression where God says it's not good for a person to be alone. So the first thing that is described as not being good is loneliness. And so again, in the Garden of Eden story, God says Adam, the man, the human, needs an ezer kenegdo. And often that is translated as helper, helpmeet, helpmate, things that can sound vaguely demeaning. But as I love to point out, the word ezer means help, and God is described as an ezer. So you can't have anything demeaning about the word ezer. And keneged has as one of its root meanings as being in opposition, like the scales of balance. So to me, the ideal relationship are two people who are helpful to one another by being a balance of emotions, a balance of skills, a balance of personalities, sort of in creative tension. And you may recall that when I wrote my rabbinic thesis, it was called Ezer Kenegdo, toward a theology of Jewish Christian partnership. Bryce.
Your helpmeet or mate or whatever is in opposition to you. How do you get along with someone with whom you are opposite?
Oh, it's funny. It would never even occur to me that that's an issue. Sonia, I'll just talk personally. Sonia has different tastes, has different standards of manners, has very different linguistic skills. She's a psychologist. I often joke that she treats computers like they're people. So when the computer's acting up, she will use language like this damn thing is just not behaving today, or it doesn't like me, and so on. And at times I will catch myself treating people like computers, namely, of course, the person's going to do this. I nicely asked them to do this, or why would they do anything illogical? So for me, it's kind of like pieces of a puzzle fitting together. The pieces are very different. And I am thrilled to have someone in my life that has skills that I lack. And I think there are times, particularly when the computers are not working, that she's happy to have me in her life and have skills that she lacks. But it's a great question, because underlying the relationship is covenant. And so there's a understanding between Sonia and I that we are committed for the long term. And although, there are times when we get angry at each other and frustrated with each other, but we always have this sense that we're committed to be there and work it out. But it's a very good question. So the woman is made out of Adam's Sela, which again, I don't know how much time I spent on this, but I have a whole discussion of this and what really happened in the Garden of Eden. A Sela is often translated as a rib, and it can be a rib, but it can also be a side. In a couple of places in the Bible, Sela means side. So, and I think I'm going to talk about this in the class on mythology. So some of the myths about the first man and the first woman is that the first man, Adam Rishon, was a hermaphrodite with both male and female characteristics. And in some imagery, they imagined it like what we might imagine as Siamese twins, where there's literally one half is male facing one direction, the other half female facing the other direction. And the surgery that's described in Genesis is one of splitting the Adam Rishon into the two halves. The shame about nakedness comes with eating the fruit of knowledge of good and evil. And so my take on the Garden of Eden story is that it's an allegory about both becoming human, making humans out of the animal, as distinct from the animal world, and becoming adult, going from babies to adults. And I have this cute slide I use in the presentation about what entities are not embarrassed about being naked. And of course, the answer is animals and babies. And humans seem to be have a sense of modesty about being naked. The term for sex in the Bible quite commonly is yodea, or knowing, which implies intimacy. There are other phrases used about sort of lying with someone or being in bed with someone, but when the term Yodea is used, it quite commonly refers to a sense of intimacy. Yes, Bryce.
Well, it's pretty clear from looking at the world that people do not inherently have any shame at being naked in front of other people. It's only a societal reaction and the knowledge that other people find it upsetting.
Yeah, but it
That,
seems to be true of every society, with a few minor
but
exceptions.
just two people by themselves in a garden would not become ashamed that they were naked, and that's just silly.
So anyway, I would say one of the things the Bible's reacting to is the clear sense that most people have a sense of modesty about showing their genitalia and their specific sex characteristics. So I think on one level the Bible is giving us a story of origins, and of course I would say again, babies are not nervous about that. So it seems to come with maturity, or the distinction between humans and animals.
Well, it's something that's taught, frankly. I mean, that's what people have to teach their kids, about don't show that stuff. It's taught.
Yes,
I mean,
but once you get the kids into junior high school, they're okay. I would just say it's universal. So,
but it's not universal. When you look at Polynesian societies,
right, with a few very minor example. Anyway, I don't want to argue it.
All right. Okay.
But clearly that's one of the major elements in the Garden of Eden story. The Bible includes relationships beyond marriage, both polygamy and concubinage. And of course, polygamy is one man with several wives, and concubinage is a relationship which is committed on some level, but without the full status of a wife. With the polygamy gets eliminated for Ashkenazim about 1,000 years ago, I think, with the influence of Christianity. And in the Sephardic world, it was never really eliminated. So in the state of Israel, polygamy is outlawed as a matter of civil law. But in Jews living in Sephardic lands and Muslim lands, certainly in Morocco, Sonia grew up knowing men that had more than one wife, and that still exists. Travis.
I think in Genesis, the story of I think it was Joseph and his brothers. Reuben was the oldest. Mm-hmm. I believe it mentioned in there that he lost his status as first son because he slept with his father's concubine.
Yes,
that was considered incest.
I don't know that the word incest would have been used. I'm not even sure but it was clearly intended to be an insult to his father, and it was received as such. The children of concubines are full children, and the best example of that, full children in the sense of being members of the tribe, and the best example of that is, as you may know, Jacob has two wives, Rachel and Leah, and two concubines, Rachel and Leah's, I guess, handmaidens, and the children of the concubines are considered full leaders of their tribes. There's no distinction between those tribes and the tribes that come out of Rachel and Leah. And I was doing some more reading about this actually today, and the commentary I read is that with the rules and regulations that are put in place in the Talmud, they basically get rid of concubinage as a legal status. I believe it doesn't currently exist in Jewish law, and didn't exist even in Talmudic law. It's sort of a biblical artifice. So as I mentioned, a goal of sexuality is pleasure and intimacy. And I mentioned that marriage is allowed even where childbearing is not possible. Men have obligations to their wives. They may not swear oaths, and vows are taken very significantly a man may not swear to not have sex with his wife. And men have sexual obligations to their wives, which is a function of their jobs. And this is only their obligation. The wife is under no obligation. I think she is not allowed to again, swear off sex, but she doesn't have, the men have obligations to their wives when she would want to have sex. And for sailors, it's twice a year, camel driver once a month, ass driver once a week, a man of leisure, a scholar every night. And I think you've heard me do that song to the tune of Achy Breaky Heart, Double Mitzvah Friday Night. And I may have mentioned when I did that song, the thing that inspired that song is a story in the Talmud about the rabbis, like congressmen, often exempt themselves from the rules. And so the rabbis exempt themselves from these rules. There's actually very detailed rules. Like a man can only travel and be away from his wife for a certain amount of time only with her permission. So in effect, it's up to her to make the decision of whether to trade off livelihood and income versus companionship and sexuality. But there's a story of a rabbinic student or a rabbi who goes off to study at a distant academy, and he only comes home once a year. When does he come home? On Yom Kippur, on Erev Yom Kippur, which is the one day of the year when you're not allowed to have sex. And so the story goes that she is still nonetheless very anxious to see him. And so she's waiting on her porch, and the sun is setting, and it's just about Yom Kippur. Meanwhile, this guy is back in the academy, and he gets so wrapped up in his studies that he doesn't realize that he has to leave a certain amount of time before sunset. You can't travel on Yom Kippur. So he misses his window to get there in time. And as the sun is setting and she realizes that he is not going to make it home in time, she cries, and a tear forms on her cheek. And when this happens, the study hall collapses and kills this guy. And it's one of the legends which talks about the particular power of tears. And it inspired me to write this song to Achy Breaky Hearts. And sounded like a country western story to me.
By the way, Rabbi, there's one line that you might want to edit.
Yeah.
Previous slide.
I'm sorry?
There's a line that you might want to edit in the previous slide.
In this one?
Yes, ask driver, should be driver.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, thank you. That's pretty important.
Yeah, it makes a big difference.
Thank you. It's
You're
amazing. I mean, can't tell you how many times I've looked at this and haven't seen it. Okay, thank you. Marriage and divorce. As I mentioned, the marriage is an innovation in that it formally protects the rights of the woman. The ketubah includes a divorce settlement and a particular set of obligations for the husband and the wife. You know, in a wedding, since Carson and Erin are getting married, you can pay particular attention to this. You always have a ketubah for a Jewish wedding, but it is rare in my personal experience to have a traditional ketubah. For one thing, a traditional ketubah is written in Aramaic, not Hebrew, and it is not lovey-dovey at all. It reads very legalistically. It has all kinds of provisions, and I've only had marriages with one or two, maybe 2 or 3 marriages where I've officiated where they had a traditional ketubah. I have never seen it translated on, you know, a pretty document that you're going to put on the wall. It would be like posting your prenuptial agreement on the wall. So most couples have what I would call a lovey-dovey ketubah. And typically it has words, often same words in Hebrew and English, about your commitment to each other, and your promise to support each other and be nurturing and so on. But that's not a traditional ketubah. In Jewish law, there are a number of ways of creating a marriage between 2 Jews. This is, of course, in traditional Jewish law. One is with a ketubah. The other, I'm sure I discussed this when when we discuss weddings. The other is to have a ring, and traditionally the ring is a very simple ring like this one. And the reason for that is, since you're giving the person a gift, the husband is giving the bridegroom's giving the bride a gift in order to acquire her. So she has to have some clear knowledge of what the gift is worth. So the tradition is to have a simple ring. And then traditional Jewish law also recognizes common law marriages, namely, if a couple lives together, in the presence of the community. Way I always describe this, it doesn't mean sneaking off to Motel 6, but it means really living together. According to some Jewish authorities, that would actually constitute a marriage. And if the couple were to decide to split up, in traditional Judaism, they would have to get a divorce, even though they had never had a formal marriage. In a modern Jewish wedding, we do all of these things. We have a section for betrothal, where we have the ring ceremony. We have a section for the marriage with blessings and the ketubah. And then typically the couple traditionally, the couple goes off and is alone for 5 or 10 minutes. And if they were a very traditional Jewish Orthodox couple, this would have been the first time they had ever been alone without presence of a chaperone. And so it's very funny when I engage in discussions like this and describe it. I've had people, I don't know if it was, I can't remember who it was, but somebody said, you know what, we did this when I was married. Right after our wedding, the rabbi took us to this little room, closed the door, and then 5 or 10 minutes later came and took us out of the room. Never explained why we were there. And this guy, the wedding was like 40 or 50 years earlier, and he never understood what that was all about. So that's also a traditional part of marriage. Divorce, as I mentioned, is mentioned in the Bible, and the Hebrew word for divorce is a get, and it's in the Bible that a man grants a get to the woman. So that creates a problem in traditional Judaism, that the man actually has to do it. And if he refuses to do it, the marriage is not dissolved. So he has a huge bargaining chip in cases of divorce. And occasionally that bargaining chip can be abused. And if the man fails to grant the woman a divorce, then she is, the Hebrew word for it is agunah, plural agunot. So she can't marry, nor can she be intimate with anyone else, because that would be adultery. So the solution to that, in the conservative movement, they created something called the Lieberman Clause as an addition to the ketubah. And the Lieberman Clause basically says, if the couple gets a civil divorce, the husband hereby grants his wife a religious divorce, or commits to grant her a religious divorce. That works in the conservative world. In the Orthodox world, because in many Orthodox, I think generally in Orthodoxy, there's a standard text of the ketubah, and they don't feel like they can change it. But I think 2/3 of Orthodox rabbis will not officiate at a wedding unless the couple has a separate side agreement, which essentially accomplishes the same goal. In the Reform movement, there is no official get. We recognize a civil divorce as also being a Jewish divorce. So when I work with couples who have been married before, if they're divorced, I don't insist to see an actual Jewish divorce. Modesty in premarital sex. So traditional Jews and traditional Judaism has many laws relating to modesty. As I mentioned before, couples are never alone until they're actually married. So one of the things, and if you've seen, oh gosh, what is it, Shtisel? I think it's on Netflix. There's a very interesting, and I think they had 2 seasons and they're about to release the 3rd season. It's basically a serial about Haredi, ultra-Orthodox couples, ultra-Orthodox Jews living in Jerusalem. And there's a lot of emphasis because the lead character is not married, a young man. So you see a lot of insight into those dating practices. But when I lived in Jerusalem, on any given night, if you walked into a hotel, you would see in the bar, in a lounge, young couples, Orthodox men. It's clear, they're wearing kind of traditional Orthodox attire, and young women, and they're having coffee or they're having a drink together in a bar. And the point is, the bar is a public place. They can speak with just each other, but no hanky-panky can take place. And then you'll often also see young couples strolling through a public park together. And as you may know, particularly if you've had any connection with Chabad, that in traditional Judaism, men and women men and women don't touch each other unless they are close relatives or married. So if this often comes up with a Chabad rabbi, say, for example, is meeting people. And if he's meeting men, he's shaking hands. Remember when we used to shake hands? He's shaking hands. And typically, if a woman is there, often she will not be aware of this. She'll put out her hand to shake, and he'll put his hand behind his back and kind of smile and bow. And it can be the source of some confusion. It can be the source of some pain because, family members, and I don't know the specific details of who's allowed to touch and who's not allowed to touch, but I know, for example, a man can't give his daughter-in-law a hug. So and that same kind of rule is also true in observant Muslims. So with those two restrictions, premarital sex is out of the question, but there's no specific sins associated with premarital sex. It is clearly not consistent with Jewish law and tradition, and I would say laws of modesty. But unlike in the Christian world, there's no specific issue with premarital sex. And the product of premarital sex is not a mamzer or a bastard in any Jewish sense of the word. As I started mentioning before, the definition of a mamzer, although, for those of us that kind of grew up in a Yiddishkeit culture, the word mamzer you would be familiar with, and it's not a nice thing to call somebody a mamzer. It's equivalent to calling somebody a bastard or a son of a bitch or whatever. But in Jewish law, the mamzer is only the product of forbidden union, such as incest or adultery. And even, you could say, technical adultery, like remarriage without a get. And the horrible thing is that a mamzer cannot marry an ordinary Jew. A mamzer can only marry another mamzer. And if you think about it for more than a few seconds, you realize that the mamzer hasn't done anything wrong. Parents did something wrong. His bio parents have done something wrong, but he or she hasn't done anything wrong. So it's horrible. So the conservative movement doesn't hold any stigmas for mamzers. The Orthodox movement does, and the problem is there is computers to keep track of who is a mamzer. And the solution to it is for the rabbi to be understanding. So I'll call on you in a second, Travis. So a couple, a guy comes to a rabbi and says, I'm getting married, but, the problem is, the guy says, I'm a mamzer. I was the product of adultery. And so the rabbi may ask some questions like, was your mother Jewish? Or is your mother Jewish? And the guy would say, of course my mother's Jewish. And he would say, what about your grandmother? Of course my grandmother's Jewish. What about your great-grandmother? Well, I assume so. I heard my grandmother talk about her. What about your great-great-great-great-grandmother? Are you certain she's Jewish? And the guy says, quite frankly, I have no idea. He says, aha, there is some suspicion that you're not actually Jewish. I'm going to take you to the mikveh, draw a drop of blood if it's a guy, because he's already been circumcised. I'm going to take you to the mikveh. Now you're Jewish, and because you've just recently been converted, you can't be a mamzer. So one of the fascinating things when I took a Jewish law course was the idea that the role of a judge in Jewish law is different than the role of a judge in Western civil law. The role of a judge in Western civil law is to be a disinterested observer of the laws of the land and apply those laws as best as he or she can to the case before the judge. A judge in Jewish law has those same responsibilities, but is also understood to be a representative of God, including God's aspect of mercy in addition to God's aspect of justice. So, Travis.
So now, if a momzer has to marry another momzer, if they have a child, would that child have a clean slate, or is there no?
I have no idea. Actually,
Okay.
It's a great question, and I have no idea what the answer is. How's that for an honest answer? And of course, in the conservative movement, there's no issues of mamzers, and in the reform movement, there's no issues of mamzers. Okay, homosexuality. The biblical source of the prohibition of homosexuality is in Leviticus in two places, and they both read something like this. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence, toeva. So I'll focus on the word toeva in a moment, but one issue is, what does it mean to lie with a male as one lies with a woman? Typically, that's been interpreted as anal penetration, but that's an open question. As we'll see in a moment, toeva is an open question. And scholars I've read on the subject probably didn't consider female lesbian relationships, female homosexual relationships as being sex at all. As far as the rabbis were concerned, somebody's penis has to penetrate somebody else for it to actually be considered sex. So I think that certainly the Bible is completely silent on the subject of female homosexuality. And I'm pretty sure even the Talmud is completely silent on that subject. I would say one of the things that the Reform tradition pays particular attention to is the word toeva. You've heard me say many times, in Reform Judaism, the focus is on ethical laws and ethical issues, how you treat one another, animals, or the environment. There's lots of ritual law in Judaism, such as keeping kosher and hanging the mezuzah and praying 3 times a day and so on. And the Reform approach I would characterize as those issues are between you and God. So then the question is, what does the Hebrew word toeva mean? Almost always translated as an abhorrence or something related to that. But when you look in the Hebrew Bible, with only one exception, a toeva refers to ritual prohibitions. So for example, in the kosher laws, it says you should not eat anything abominable, using the same word. There is a prohibition against marrying your ex-wife. If you are married with someone and then you divorce, and if she has had a sexual relationship between the time after you've divorced her, then she is toeva to you in the future. There's a prohibition of women wearing men's clothing. That's also described as toeva. And then lots of characterizations of the practices of other nations, consulting spirits, worshiping other gods. There's even a mention that Egyptians, in the story of Joseph, that the Egyptians found eating with non-Egyptians to be abhorrent, using that same term toeva. sacrifice and offerings without ethical behavior, also described as toeva. So at best, I would say the Reformed tradition would say that homosexuality is as bad as a woman wearing pants or eating non-kosher food. But I think that would be a mischaracterization of the Reform movement. I would say most Reform rabbis I know would treat a loving, committed relationship between two men or two women exactly the same as people that are of the opposite sex. And when it comes to marriage, except for the Hebrew being a gendered language, the ceremonies that I conduct when I join two men or two women are absolutely identical to the ceremony that I would use in joining a man and a woman together. So many Reform rabbis are homosexual, and I would say most Reform rabbis, in fact, I'm not aware of any Reform rabbi that will not officiate at a same gender marriage. And now this is more recently the conservative movement. The big issue in both the Reform world and in the conservative world was would you accept as a student for the rabbinate, student for ordination, an openly gay or lesbian man or woman? And the Reform movement has for quite some time. Within the last few years, maybe within the last 10 years, the conservative movement also now is open, at least in the West Coast campus, to gay and lesbian men and women. And I think the only issue is, since they are, very focused on Jewish law and Torah, they would argue that a man lying with a man as with a woman is still forbidden by Torah law, but they're not going to be inquiring about sexual practices, and I'm not sure they would have anything to say about lesbians. So any question on that? Okay, adultery. Adultery traditionally, I was doing more research on this today, only involved a married woman having sex with a man not her husband. So since biblically a man could have more than one wife, and having sex between people who are not married is not a violation of the law against adultery. Remember, adultery is pretty severe. It's punishable by death in the Bible. And both parties are punishable by death. It's not just the woman or not just the man. So traditionally, a married man having sex with a woman not her husband would not be considered adultery. And I tried to get a clear understanding of where that stands today, and I couldn't tell if that rule still exists technically in the Orthodox world. It certainly has been. I would say men and women are treated equally for purposes of adultery in the Reform and conservative world. Mainly, again, because a major tenet of Reform Judaism is to recognize the equality of men and women. Reform Judaism, actually, I wrote this slide some time ago, and I realized I was summarizing there's technically 5 different forms of adultery in a very interesting article on sexuality in Reform Judaism. But in summary, you have the classic adultery of people who are not married to each other, but are married having sex, and whether that is, I don't even know what they call it these days. I'm probably dating myself by using the term open marriage. People still talk about open marriages?
Yes,
Okay.
they do.
Okay, good, because I have been out of town and I'm not up to date on jargon. So even in a world where, let's say, both the husband and wife agree that they don't object to their partners having sex with other people, even the Reform movement would still consider that adultery and a prohibited relationship. Then there's also, I guess, what I called here unknowing adultery. So the classic example is, let's say, a married man on a business trip, having sex with someone not his wife. He is clearly guilty of adultery, but if she is not aware that he's married, the Reform movement would argue that she is not guilty of adultery because she didn't know, that he was married to someone else.
Ah,
And then the other form, which you could call technical or circumstantial, would be one where, let's say, a couple has separated, but they haven't yet had either a legal or a religious divorce, but it's clear they're not getting together again, and they have intimate relations. That would, I think they call that technical adultery. And a circumstantial adultery would be a case where, let's say, one partner has a lifelong illness. Imagine, one partner being in a nursing home, and with an incurable, debilitating disease, and the other partner is having a sexual relationship. And I would say the Reform movement is very sympathetic to those situations. Bryce.
what was really fascinating was the uh, the case where the partner does not know that this other person is married.
Right.
Okay, now through most of my other experience with Judaism, knowledge of whether the act that you're doing is a sin is not an issue. If you do it, it's a sin, regardless of whether you know you're doing it or not.
What I would say is, and we've had discussions about this, there are deliberate sins and inadvertent sins. And I don't know if in the Orthodox world, if a woman having sex with someone, well, in the Orthodox world, this might not arise because the only issue would be, is the woman, okay, no, there is an issue. So let's say you have a married woman and she has sex with a man and he doesn't know she's married.
Exactly.
So now the question is he guilty of adultery?
Exactly.
And clearly in the Reform movement, we would say no.
Mm-hmm.
In the Orthodox movement, again, I was doing a little reading on this today. I think they might say yes, but he wouldn't be subject to being put to death, even in biblical law. So it would be considered, and again, in Jewish tradition, there is a distinction between sins that are deliberate and sins that are not deliberate. And another classic example that I use often is, you wake up one morning, you've been ill, and you don't realize it's Shabbat because you've had a high fever and now you're feeling okay, and you stumble into the bathroom and you turn on the lights and you turn on the radio and you realize it's Saturday. The question is, have you sinned? Yes, but it's an inadvertent sin, not a deliberate sin. So that is an important distinction. There's a wonderful rabbi, I guess he would be part of the Jewish renewal movement, named Arthur Waskow. And he takes, I would say, a very liberal, progressive view toward Judaism, but one still bound by texts. And I love that when you can dig into the text and be creative. And so what he says is that for the past X thousands of years since Judaism's been around, the primary purpose of sexuality is reproduction and fulfilling the commandment, be fruitful and multiply and inherit the earth, and and so on. And what Rabbi Waskow says is, check that one off the list. We've done it. In fact, we may well have overdone it. We may well have been too fruitful and too successful in multiplying, and therefore we don't need sexuality to fulfill that mitzvah. So then he says, there's another book of the Bible, and that book is the Song of Songs. And in that book, It's very erotic. It's very sexual, particularly if you can find a good translation that's not embarrassed about the sexuality. And it doesn't speak of having children or even the couple being married. They are just enjoying each other. So what Rabbi Waskow says is we now just change our key biblical text from Genesis to Shir HaShirim, to the Song of Songs. And in fact, when often if you buy a ketubah for your wedding, you will see at the top the phrase Ani l'dodi v'dodi li. I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. And when I officiated a marriage, I always like my men to use the traditional statement when handing his wife or his partner a ring. And then I love the other partner to say something different. And the phrase I really love is Ani l'dodi v'dodi li. I am my beloved's and my beloved is mine. Since we have a little bit of time, there is a really some interesting Kabbalistic texts on sex and sexuality. And it's actually from this book, Danny Matt's The Essential Kabbalah. And
by the way, Rabbi, did you
Yes.
finish all 5 cases of adultery? I think we interrupted that. I don't know if you
No,
finished all
I
5.
combined some of them. So I
Okay.
combined what they call technical adultery, which is having intimate relations when you're separated, with I think I called it inadvertent adultery, which is, let's say, or I don't know what I called it, but a spouse in a nursing home. Yeah, I didn't go down through all 5.
Thank you.
Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit about sexuality in a Kabbalistic text. This is 13th century, so I can just point down here. Sexual union is holy and pure when performed in the right way at the right time with the right intention. Let no one think there is anything shameful or ugly in such union. God forbid. The right kind of union is called knowing, and it isn't called that for nothing. Unless it were very holy, it would not be called knowing. The matter is not, as Moses Maimonides of blessed memory imagined and thought in the Guide of the Perplexed, where he praises Aristotle for stating that the sense of touch is shameful. God forbid. This matter is not, as the Greeks said. What he said smacks of subtle heresy. If that Greek scoundrel believed that the world was created with divine intention, he would not have said what he said. But we who possess the Holy Torah believe that God created everything as divine and as divine wisdom decreed. God created nothing shameful or ugly. If sexual union is shameful, then the genitals are too. Yet you, God, created them. How could God create something blemished, disgraceful, or deficient? After all, the Torah says, God saw everything he had made, and behold, very good. The evidence is clear. In the account of creation, we read, the 2 of them were naked, the man and wife, yet they felt no shame. Before they ate from the tree of knowledge, they were contemplating the pure forms, and their intention was entirely holy. To them, the genitals were like eyes or hands or other parts of the body. When the sexual union is for the sake of heaven, there is nothing as holy and pure. The union of man and woman, when it is right, is the secret of civilization. Thereby one becomes a partner with God in the act of creation. This is the secret meaning of the saying of the sages, when a man unites with his wife in holiness, the divine presence is between them. I think that's from the Talmud. Human thought has the power to expand and ascend to its origin. Attaining the source, she is joined, I think the word she there refers to human thought, with the upper light from which she emanated. I had a footnote there. She and he become one. When thought emanates once again, all become a single ray. The upper light is drawn down by the power of thought. In this way, the divine presence appears on earth. A bright light shines and spreads around the place where the mediator is sitting. Similarly, when a man and woman unite and their thoughts join the beyond, that thought draws down the upper light. You should welcome her with words that draw her heart, calm her mind, and bring her joy. That her mind will be linked with yours and your intention with her. Speak with her words that arouse desire, love, and passionate union, and words that draw her to the awe of God. A second text. This is 18th century. I once heard a chaste man bemoaning the fact that sexual union is inherently pleasurable. He preferred that there be no physical pleasure at all, so that he could unite with his wife solely to fulfill the command of his creator, be fruitful and multiply. What he said helped me understand the saying of our rabbis, may their memory be a blessing. One should hallow himself during sexual union. I took this to mean that one should sanctify one's thought by eliminating any intention of feeling physical pleasure. One should bemoan the fact that pleasurable sensation is inherent to this act, if only it were not so. Sometime later, God favored me with a gift of grace, granting me understanding that the essence of sexual holiness, understanding of the essence of sexual holiness. The holiness derives precisely from feeling the pleasure. The secret is wondrous, deep, and awesome. So I think particularly the previous text where he's talking about Maimonides and Aristotle, Maimonides is very much known for being an admirer of Aristotle and of Greek thought. And in Greek thought, and again, some of you, I have no question, are probably more knowledgeable on this subject than I. In Greek thought, there's a very much a distinction between the physical body and the spirit. And because Christianity arises in no small part out of Greek thought, we get this sense of the spirit being kind of holy and transcendent, and the flesh just something you have to drag along with the body. And so the writings I read about Judaism and sexuality certainly move away from that idea, although clearly Maimonides didn't. And I remember reading once that this idea of body and soul not being sort of at opposite ends of the spectrum, sometimes described as lovers. And in the class on Jewish mythology, we're going to talk about the mythology of God and the goddess, God and God's bride, which is a very interesting mythology, and the feminine aspect of God and the yearning towards God's union with his bride. Okay, let me not go there. So now the question is, do you guys have any questions? This is our last session. I've enjoyed having you, and I'm always here. You can always, as some of you have sent me emails from time to time and said, can we get together and talk about something? And I'm always happy to do that. Yes, Murray.
I would imagine that the men who were adults who had the circumcision, have any of them come to you a year later after the pain has subsided and said, wow, this is much better. I wish I did this years ago?
No, but
so they think
I never considered myself their sexual therapist or.
Well, you're a rabbi. They could tell you anything.
They can. And
what I mean,
it's pretty amazing what some do, but not that one.
What I mean is as being somebody who's unable to know the before and after. Yes. That's a critical thing in Judaism. That's like the first thing that happens to you as a man is you get sliced. So yes, why? And does that have something to do with the pleasure ability or the pleasure ability of sex? In other words, does the woman enjoy it more?
I suppose.
I have never surveyed.
I suppose of the universe of people that could answer your two questions, there are probably more women who have had experience with circumcised and uncircumcised men than men that have adult experience in both directions. That's just my guess on that subject.
Okay, so what's
but none of them have reported back to me.
Well, could you get some information, because it's hard to?
No, I don't think I can. If you can suggest a way of me getting that information that will not bring me before a civil judge or the CCAR ethics committee, I'll be
Tell them you're doing
open.
a sociological experiment. I mean,
Yes, so I encourage you to try it, and
well,
you know,
I don't have
and
the
I'm a
reach that you
chaplain, and I
do.
visit people in jail. And
Well, as I said, aside from that, I mean,
no,
that's
so people have.
Is pleasurability somehow linked to the fact that Jews get circumcised at 8 days?
So I have never heard a speculation in serious Jewish sources that one of the reasons for circumcision is to increase the pleasure associated with sex.
Okay, that sounds like quite an oversight.
Okay, so it may be true. I have heard in other sources of people just writing about circumcision that may be the case.
This is the 21st century. I'm surprised that there isn't any information. You know what? I'll check the internet after this. I'm sure.
Yeah. So it'd be really interesting to.
But it was also my understanding that the reason. Certainly, they don't say, "Well, we're doing this to these little babies because when they grow up to be adults, and of course they're adults at 13. I mean, back then you could die when you're 20. That it's done for such and such reason." But it was also my understanding that it was done to a baby as a kind of secondary post-traumatic thing, because just being born is a stress. Certainly, it's like, oh, wait a second, what is all this? That it was done to a baby, since a baby cannot participate in such activities, that it was something to do with elevating the mind, that those energies, that pent-up energy that would normally be used for sexuality is used to a higher purpose, something maybe, again, in Kabbalistic terms, with regard to
I've never heard
the
that.
latter.
I have never heard that.
All right. Well, I mean, it's just.
So there's.
I mean, if God wanted Abraham to just mark, like, hey.
Yeah.
Like,
so
hey,
the question is, why is there circumcision in traditional Judaism? And people will comment on the medical aspects, and I have heard doctors talk about the fact that circumcision seems to have a health benefit, although there's controversy about that.
Yes, there is.
And otherwise, it's a strange mark. And the Jewish writings I've seen on it talk about the idea that it's a very vivid symbol that the world isn't perfect and neither is a male body. Namely, we have to correct it.
Well, that was one of the problems in early Christianity, was that the men didn't want to get snipped, because when they were in the public bathhouses, immediately you'd be able to tell, well, you're a Christian, or you're a Jew, you're not one of us.
Yeah, well, the Greeks the Greeks idealized the human body. You'd have wrestling in the nude and Greek Olympics in the nude and so on. They idealized the human body, and circumcision was understood to be an abuse. I can't think of the right word, of the body.
Of course, it's a mutilation.
A mutilation, that was the word I was looking for. So in Greek thought, the Jews appeared like they mutilated their bodies. And so that was the embarrassment. I think it wasn't so much you would be discovered.
Literally, I think it was more about being outed as a minority class.
I don't know if that was an issue in early Christianity. In early Christianity, there's this big issue of law versus.
Well, certainly one of the issues of early Christianity was, do you have to become a Jew first?
Yes.
And at some point they decided, no, you can go straight to Christianity.
Right. That's the.
My understanding is that up until the time of the first Olympiad, somewhere in that time, the male circumcision was not as complete as it became after that. It was actually reversible, so you could become an adult and say, I don't want to appear like this anymore, and that they changed the nature of circumcision so it was no longer reversible, so it was more complete.
Yeah,
I've only read that in the popular press. I haven't read that.
Yeah, I've never heard that. What there is in the discussion of the Maccabees, during that time, there was, because the Jews, for reasons that Murray alludes to, didn't want to be seen as circumcised, they would undergo a very painful process, I think it was called priapism, where the skin around where the foreskin used to be was stretched by actually hanging weights. By piercing the skin and hanging weights, they would stretch the skin. But I've never heard, and maybe true, I've just never heard that the technique of circumcision changed. I do want to just mention that many cultures practice circumcision. In fact, different Muslim cultures practice circumcision. I don't know if they all do, or if each one has its own set of rules and a set of and an age at which they circumcise their males. In many cultures, circumcision was a puberty rite. And so, boys were circumcised at 12, 13, or 14. And
most people, when you hear the word circumcision, you think of a male. But 10 years ago, I discovered with horror that in many African countries, there's female circumcision and different kinds.
I would say that's a misuse of the word circumcision.
Well, again, the word mutilation is
because the purpose there,
and it horrified me.
The purpose there is actually the inverse of the earlier one you suggested, because the clitorectomy, which is what we're talking about, is designed to reduce a woman's sexual pleasure, and thereby presumably keeping her more faithful.
And what's that word, abhorrent? Because that's abhorrent.
Yeah, I would say that's more than toeva. It's not ritual. And so in Judaism, we are especially prone to object to the use of the word circumcision for that.
Well, it's a circumcision.
It is a clitorectomy.
No, I mean for the male, it's a circumference.
Yes.
Scissors. So, the other thing I can't remember if you had ever brought up the separatist movement of Hasidism in any of these lectures.
Yes.
When most people think of Orthodox, they think of the Hasidim, but that's relatively new invention, only a few centuries old.
Yes, that's true. So until about 200 years ago, there were no movements in Judaism. People were just Jewish. The first movement within Judaism, well, as a movement, is the Reform movement. Yet there are different groups of Jews. So basically, Jews were all observant. Some were more observant, some were less observant. About 1700, so somewhere around 300 years ago, there is a movement started by a guy who becomes known as the Baal Shem Tov. We actually talked about this last week.
Sorry, I missed that one.
Yeah, so anyway, that is a particular movement called Hasidic Judaism. And his disciples, you had a Rebbe in each town. So there are probably 20 to 40 different Hasidic movements, one of which is Chabad. But in addition to Hasidic Orthodox Jews, there are what is often called modern Orthodox Jews. And the example I would use would be Jared Kushner. Jared and Ivanka Kushner are modern Orthodox Jews. So it's basically they follow a different Rebbe and a different set of teachings, but they would all consider themselves Orthodox and observant. I'm having trouble following all the chat, and I'm definitely not going to. You've heard MC? What is MC? Male circumcision? Oh, male circumcision. Yeah, I don't know. I don't remember life before my circumcision. I only know they told me I couldn't walk for a year, but I don't think that was necessarily related. Any other open-ended questions or closed-ended questions?
Sorry.
Beth, you had your hand up before.
Oh, that was for my husband. But anyways,
Yeah.
I have a question that I've noticed seeing more and more references to the Reed Sea as opposed to the Red Sea.
Yes.
And just from my background, I was told that people who said that it was the Reed Sea were making, it was at that time, it was Christians who were saying Reed Sea, not Jews. And it was a mistake of English, of understanding of English, so that they were saying there was a problem, that it wasn't red, it was reed, and it didn't have anything to do with what Hebrew meant, or,
Oh, okay.
And I've noticed now that I've seen that Reed Sea, and I don't actually know, I mean,
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. The Hebrew is I think pretty unambiguous. It's Yam Suf, and in other places, Yam is sea, Suf is reeds. And I think in other places, like the story of Moses being hidden among the bulrushes and so on, that word is used. So I don't think there's any controversy that it's the Sea of Reeds.
Any idea how we got to the Red Sea then?
I'm not sure, except that in that area we have a sea called the Red Sea. So I don't know when people started conflating the two. And, it would be kind of interesting to see, to look in like the King James Bible and see if they call it the Reed Sea or the Red Sea. I don't know if it comes out of an old translation, like a Greek translation, or whether it's just because there clearly is a sea that we call the Red Sea, and there's nothing that we call the Reed Sea that we're aware of. But it's a very good question.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Anything else? Someone else was starting to ask something. No?
I was going to mention regarding Judah and his relationship with his daughter-in-law, who he
Judah
found on the
Tamar.
side of the road.
Yes.
What was going on over there?
Well, the story is pretty clear. It's a very interesting story. Judah, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. Jacob has 12 sons, one of whom is Judah. The story of Judah is he has 3 sons, and his oldest son gets married to a woman named Tamar, and he dies, Tamar. And then under the law of Levirate marriage, the next oldest brother, Onan, is obligated to marry Tamar, but he doesn't want to do that because if he marries Tamar, the first child will be considered the child of his older brother and get all the inheritance, and Onan's other children won't get any inheritance anyway. So Onan practices coitus interruptus, which is sometimes given the word onanism, and called masturbation, but it's basically wasting seed, and he drops dead. So now Judah's getting a little suspicious, having seen 2 of his 3 sons marry Tamar and dropping dead. So although under the law, Judah would be obligated to have Tamar marry his youngest son, he basically tells Tamar, go back to your parents' home. Don't call me, I'll call you. And so he doesn't comply with the law. Meanwhile, Tamar wants what's hers. So she dresses up as a prostitute by the side of the road, and there's a book called The Harlot by the Side of the Road, entices Judah to have sex with her and has a child. And later on, it becomes told to Judah that his daughter-in-law, who is legally bound to his youngest child, is pregnant. And it turns out there's proof, it just depends how deeply in the story you want to go. But she has proof that it was Judah, not
something
anyone
about
else.
a scarf or a staff.
To Judah's credit, he admits. Imagine someone who actually admits to having sinned and making a mistake. Well, that happens right there. And it's actually one of the reasons the rabbis think so much of Judah, and one of the reasons why the rabbis say that the Messiah will come from the line of Judah. And so that's sort of interesting. And indeed,
and those are the two. She has two children.
Yes, she has 2 children, and one of them will become a in the line of King David. So it's a very interesting story. I have another. I can't remember if I have a YouTube video on this, but I have the slides on my website called "Illicit Sex in the Bible."
And the two children. It's interesting because they tie a red thread around the first one who goes back inside for some reason. I mean, it's just
yeah. I mean, a child. The first child is initially a breech, so his foot comes out, and the midwife ties a string around the foot because it's important from the point of view of who is the older child to recognize which one is born earlier. And I guess the rule goes, if any part comes out, you become the older child. And
isn't the Jewish law that you're not actually born till you're fully out?
I think the Jewish understanding is you become a living soul once you draw a breath. But I don't know how it relates to the question of if there are twins and one twin puts out a body part first, but the second person is fully born first, which one is considered the eldest from the standpoint of the laws?
It reminded me of the Jacob and Esau.
Yes,
birth.
Yes, it's another twin story. Absolutely. Yep. Yeah, I do have a separate little fun thing about all of many of the examples in the Bible of strange sexual unions. And for an even stranger reason, they all seem to be in the line of the Messiah. So I find that deeply interesting. Okay.
There's other stories about Lot and his
daughters also in the line of the Messiah.
The first is when the two angels come and he's protecting the angels, and the townsfolk are banging on his door.
Yep. There's all kinds of fun.
He offers his two virgin daughters, and they don't want the two girls. They want the two guys, the two angels.
Not clear. But anyway, maybe that is clear.
That's who they want. And those are the ones who go off to Sodom and Gomorrah and destroy it.
No, they're living in Sodom. They are the ones that leave after Sodom is destroyed, and they have sex with their father.
Yes, Lot, his two daughters are afraid that they're the last people on earth.
Exactly.
So one is the head, becomes the head of the Moabites, who
yes, and the word Moab means from dad.
Oh, I see. I never knew. And the other one is the head of the Ammonites.
Very good. Yep. Okay. Any other questions? Biblical trivia. I can do Deuteronomy for 200 shekels. Okay, so hearing none, I just want to remind you that starting the first Tuesday nights, these are Tuesday nights at 7 o'clock, same channel here. I'm going to be doing 5 different sessions, and I haven't yet laid them out, so I'm spending a lot of time digging into this material on the mythology of Judaism. And the subjects I mentioned here are myths of angels, the Garden of Eden, the Messiah, hell, the angel of death, Lilith, and the Shekhinah, the bride of God. So it's really fun material. And it occurred to me that every session will begin with me posting the rhetorical question that many of you know our friend Jay asks at Torah Study. Bryce, I know you know who I'm talking about, and Beth knows. The question is, am I supposed to believe this? And the answer is no. In Judaism, you can believe whatever you want to believe. So these mythical stories, I think, are the spices and musical flavor of these traditions, rather than, the dry issue of how do I tie the tzitzit.
Will you be covering Sheol when you?
Yeah, well, that's hell.
Hell.
Yes. Yes.
Oh, that is hell. I normally think of it as kind of limbo.
Yeah, well, yeah, I mean, we'll be talking about it. But broadly speaking, that's what I mean. Okay, well, thank you all for bearing with me for 18 weeks. Yasher koach. Many of you that are here tonight have almost perfect or nearly perfect attendance records. So there's a saying, I think it comes out of Psalms, which says, more than the baby calf wants to suckle, the mama cow wants to nurse. And it's applied often to teachers, which is more than students may want to learn, teachers want to teach. And so it's my way of saying I am grateful to you because I couldn't do this without you. And again, you know where to find me, email, phone, and so on. I always want you to think of me as your rabbi and as someone who is available to you. And some of you I know are on a path of conversion with me working more closely. And I'll see some of you tomorrow night. So thank you. And stay well.
Thank you.
It's going to be an interesting week, as always.
Thank you.
Thank you, Heather.
Okay, be
Thank you, Ab.
well.
Stay safe.
See you
Yeah.
soon.
Night.
Stay safe.
Oops. Wait.
I made up the ones that I